in advance if we don't have time to address all your questions. This event is part of our Dublin Voices series, celebrating the best new Irish literature, and we'd like to thank our partners at the Embassy of Ireland, Solus Nua, and Georgetown's Global Irish Studies program for their support. It is now my pleasure to introduce tonight's guests. Emma Dabiri is an Irish-American author, academic, and broadcaster. Her work can be found within The Guardian, Irish Times, Dublin Inquirer, and in a number of academic journals. Tonight, we get the pleasure of discussing her book, Twisted, The Tangled History of Black Hair Culture. Through the lens of hair texture, Dabiri leads us on a historical and cultural investigation of the global history of racism and her own personal journey of self-love and finally acceptance. Moderating tonight's conversation is Nigerian-American author Tope Folarin. He is a Rhodes Scholar, the winner of the Kane Prize for African Writing, and his debut novel is called A Particular Kind of Black Man. Please welcome Emma and Tope.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for that introduction. Emma, I have to say that I really, really loved your book. I really did. And
I'm so happy to hear that.
It was really, the thing is, like, I haven't had, Emma and I were talking before this began, and I'm kind of like in the trenches right now because I have a 4-month-old and a 3-year-old, and so I'm not sleeping much, and life is really crazy right now. And as it happens, our baby arrived just after the kind of stay in place order went down here in DC. So I've not really left the apartment in a long time, and so I read this very quickly over the course of the past 2 days, and I guess for me, there's a kind of personal component here that's incredibly important to me as the father of 2 young Black girls. I've been thinking obsessively about hair and about the way they see themselves for the past, certainly since my older daughter was born, for the past few years. So it hit me in a kind of personal way, in a way that I hadn't anticipated. But there's also the kind of, obviously, kind of intellectual aspect as well. And I will get into the intellectual component a bit later on, but I was really edified on that level as well by this book. So just at the outset, I wanted to congratulate you on this book. And I wanted to ask also how you're feeling at this particular moment in history before we kind of delve into the book. There's so much that's happening. There's COVID, there's the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. How are you feeling as a kind of human being at this point?
Oh my goodness. I feel like I've lived 10 lives in the past, since March. There have been so many wildly different phases to this period. I mean, the pandemic itself seemed like something very surreal and dystopian that had suddenly just intruded on our reality. Then it took this completely unexpected revolutionary turn again, which was just, I didn't see that coming.
Yeah.
I also have a very young baby, slightly older than yours, but still not 9 months.
Yeah.
And we too have just spent most of this period in our apartment with my older son and my husband as well. And then, I mean, just when the lockdown started to be kind of easing up, although I've also found that very distressing because it's easing up, but the rates, but the threat of the danger hasn't gone away. So it's like you can go out, but you don't want to.
Yeah.
And then I think kind of most significantly, my father passed away in Lagos very recently.
Sorry to hear that.
Connected to all of this. And that happening and still not being able to move or be with any family and still just being in my apartment. Yeah. Again, that surrealness and just another, like a new heaviness. So it's just been a very, very intense few months, it's like overwhelming in many ways.
Goodness, my sincere condolences to you on the loss. And it's especially, I'm sure, kind of poignant at this moment because I imagine that you haven't been able to go back to Nigeria since that occurred.
Exactly. Or see any relatives, and the funeral just happened like very quickly. We couldn't be there or anything. So it's just adding to the difficulty of processing it, you know?
Yeah.
Um, so yeah.
Yeah. The one thing that struck me as I was reading the book is that it's just so timely. It seems to have, at least certainly here, I know it's been out in the UK for a bit, but
Mhm.
here in the States, it's arriving at a really sort of important time. And I know like the process, having just kind of concluded the process myself of writing a book and not knowing when it'll enter the world and what the world will be like when the book enters the world.
Mhm.
Um, I just wanted to know when you started writing it and how that process went for you.
Yeah. Congratulations on finish. You said you just finished yourself.
Oh my debut came out last August. So, but yeah, it's been out for a while. But just kind of like it's still fresh. The kind of the journey, if you
Yeah.
will, is still fresh.
Um, yeah. So it took me. How long? When did I start writing it? I started writing it probably. I'm trying to just think where we are because time has just taken on entirely new qualities in this period, which is also I have a chapter on
I was gonna
time
say, yeah,
in the book.
yeah,
But I started writing it, I believe, in 2017. I think early 2017. Yeah, and I finished it in 2019. I was writing it like right up to the wire,
yeah.
like the galleys or the proofs, as we call them in the UK, came out like so late because, and even post them coming out, I basically rewrote the book. Like, so I was writing right up to the wire.
An
So
editor's dream, right? They love you.
yeah, it wasn't stressful or fraught at all. Um, so I was writing it in earnest for 2 years, but I would say in some ways I've been writing it like my whole life because
Yeah,
I have elements in there of earlier writings, earlier ideas, ideas that have been with me since childhood. Um, uh, Things that I read when I was a child, things that I wrote when I was a child, music that I listened to as a child. Like I was able to draw on like all of those resources. So I had like a lifetime's I had a lifetime's kind of research.
yeah,
Um, because I've had a lot of people say, "Oh, how did you pull so much material together in that period?" And I feel like it's material that I was already pulling together before there was even any prospect
yeah.
of writing a book. um so yeah.
Yeah. Well, obviously, this book is about hair, and at least it's partly about hair. And I love the thing I love most about the book is that hair is kind of it's about hair, but hair serves as this kind of platform to discuss so much more. And so I was wondering if you could talk a bit about your hair journey and where you are now with your hair.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, the book is ostensibly about hair, but I
Yeah.
very much used hair as a method to explore themes that you might not immediately imagine would be connected to hair. But
Yeah.
I thought it was, I had a friend who described it as the book as a Trojan horse, that you think it's about one thing, but it's really smuggling in a lot of other ideas. But to bring it back, and actually one of the first edits of the book, my editor was like, "This is great, but remember the book's actually about hair." I think I'd just written a history of the colonization of Nigeria, to be honest. So yeah. um, so I went back and went back to the original proposal, and my own hair was something that I detested as a
Sure.
child. That I felt, well, I was made to feel like it was just like it was an affliction, like
Yeah.
it was like a disability almost. It was just something that was like very wrong and just needed to be um needed to be transformed, needed to be changed, but in like through, I feel like, quite punitive measures, you know, because there was this sense of it just being bad and wrong. And I just had like a deep antipathy to it. And I just felt like it was the thing that really singled me out rather, as an object of scrutiny, but also like just a lot of racism and a lot of negativity. And I was quite fixated on my hair. Like I really felt like if I could make my hair look normal, then I would be normal and I would be treated as though I was normal. So I really felt like my hair was like a big affliction that needed to be resolved. And I was embarrassed. I was really embarrassed of how it looked.
Yeah.
And then through that, so I guess I did everything that one can do to transform their hair, but it was also in the context of being in Ireland in the 1980s, with a white mom. So like none of the products, none of the expertise that would be necessary to actually, you know, do my hair. So not only did I hate the texture and the way it looked, also nobody knew how to do it. So it was, I think, objectively a mess, you know, like it wasn't well cared for at all. Tangled, matted, a mess. And occasionally my mum had, there were very, very few Black people in Ireland at the time. My mum had like one or two Nigerian friends, and occasionally they'd like give me like cane rows, but like I didn't want that either, you know. I wanted like long, like swishy princess hair, like the other girls. So yeah, kind of. I thought I liked it. That was me. That was me then. So yeah, I didn't want like a traditional, like kind of African hairstyle. You know, I wanted like princess hair. So I started, I think the first time I put a texturizer on it when I was like about 10, one of my mum's friends did. And I remember she was like, oh, Emma's hair is like really coarse. So we need to leave the texturizer on for longer. And then it looked great for a few hours and started to fall out by the next morning. And that was my first experience like with chemicals. And yeah, so that was me. I mean, obviously I learned how to do it eventually. I also left Ireland, moved to the UK, actually got like a Black hairdresser who could like relax my hair properly. And then I finally had achieved like the hair of my dreams. Like I had long, straightened hair. I had my tracks, so it was really long and flicky. And I was just like, yeah, I'm winning. Despite like all my scalp was like, I always got chemical burns. My scalp's quite sensitive. My scalp was like very painful to the touch, always. But I never even like associated, I had like cognitive dissonance, you know, I never really made the link between that and the relaxers. I was just like, oh, I have a painful scalp, but look, my hair is swishing. But I feel like I felt that it came to a point where I really couldn't reconcile my politics. I know for a lot of people they say it's not political, their decision to go natural, but for me it really was. I felt like I couldn't reconcile my politics initially with what I was doing to my hair. So when I was pregnant with my first son, I just cut it. I just cut it all off. I cut it all off. Yeah, the big chop. And like I hated it, but I was just like, oh, this is a sacrifice I have to make for the cause, but I'm just going to be like a frumpy militant feminist. I was like, there's no way I can be like an attractive woman, but this is my sacrifice, which was again ludicrous. But it took me about 2 years. He's almost 8 now, so this is like 9 years ago. It took me a year or two really to actually start like enjoying my hair and growing to appreciate it and learning how to do it. And now the versatility and the fact, I mean, it also just suits me better when it's like braided or when it's in like traditional styles. I wear like a lot of traditional, like Yoruba, a lot of like traditional braided styles, and it just suits my face better. And it's also like the same, the versatility. It looks different from like one day to the next, because literally this texture you can achieve anything. So yeah. that's where I'm at now. Long answer, sorry.
Oh, no, that's great. That's great. I guess for me, one of the most compelling threads in the book, and there are many really important threads, is like you talk about that the language that we use to describe hair both reflects like a Western bias about the kind of hair that's desirable and the kind of hair that isn't. And at the same time, this language perpetuates these biases across geography and time. I was wondering if you could talk a bit about like the role of language in terms of the way that we perceive our own hair as Black folk, as white folk across the board.
Yeah, absolutely. So when I started to think about the words and the terms that are used to describe beautiful hair and idealized hair, and remembering that hair in terms of like femininity and actually humanity, which is a theme I talk about in the book, is extremely potent. Like our hair is infused with a great power. So when you think about the terms that are used to describe what is considered beautiful hair and idealized hair, all of the characteristics are the complete antithesis of the characteristics of my hair or of Afro hair, particularly the more tightly coiled textures. Yeah, the fours, the whole, so that I have issues with that categorization, but I still refer to it in the book, just for the sake of actually because when you talk about Black hair, there's like there's actually quite a broad spectrum of textures that are included under the banner of Black hair, but within that, obviously, some hair that is the result of mixed ancestry somewhere along the line is the idealized hair. So the hair that kind of grows down, that straightens more easily, that can look kind of glossy and shiny more easily, that's a looser curl, that is evidence of mixing somewhere. Because the person can be dark skinned and have that type of hair, but it usually is reflective of there being some mixed ancestry somewhere. But the hair that is more like kind of commonly perceived as like West African hair is like the most stigmatized type of hair. So sorry, the language. So the language around hair is to describe our hair. I was just like, oh gosh, in English, there's no, like the words that are used to, not even trying to be insulting, but literally just to describe what it looks like, are all pejorative. It's like coarse, unruly, wild, unmanageable. I really couldn't think of any ordinary term that reflects the beauty or the versatility of my hair. Everything was negative. And I was like, the best I can think of, sometimes you see it referred to as like cool or funky.
Yeah. Sure.
I've had quite a lot of people go, like a funky. Yeah. Maybe funky has a different, does it have a different meaning in the States?
I'm saying like if that's what this can do, like that's.
So I was looking at the products, even like for natural hair, and they're still all saying unruly, defiant, unmanageable, coarse. I was like, even the products for our hair are reinforcing this negative idea of our hair. And I started to think, how would our hair be described in African languages?
Yeah.
And it isn't the parallel. The parallel for beautiful hair doesn't reflect the norms of Caucasian hair. So it's not like there's a translation. When you translate it into Yoruba, it's like the translation of glossy or shiny. No, because it's a completely different criteria of measuring, or it's a completely different criteria of what is considered like hair to have. And the terms, the words and phrases that I looked at both in Yoruba and in Mende all spoke about the voluminousness of the hair, the fullness of the hair, the idea that hair is like hair grows from one's head in the same way that a tree grows leaves or flowers. So referencing that kind of like abundance of the earth's bounty were some of the references that you saw in Yoruba. That was from Mende. In Yoruba, there were phrases that spoke about hair that parted well was aspirational hair, because then it like it braids well.
Yeah.
A woman's braided hair is her beauty. So it was just a completely different norm, you know. It wasn't trying to understand our hair within terms that exist to describe hair that is the opposite of ours.
Yeah, that makes a great deal of sense. So I guess the thing that surprises me most about this book is that hair, the way that we think about it, the way we style it, the way we obsess over it, really has this power it's incredible power to explain so much about our society and about the way it's structured and ordered. The way we think about, you point this out in the book, the way we think about time, what we find aesthetically pleasing, even the way our language is structured seems to have like really close associations with hair. Did you know that hair had such like explanatory power when you started writing this book?
I suspected that it did, but I didn't realize the depths
Yeah.
to which it did. But I definitely had a sense that it did, because I just know the impact my hair texture has had on my life. You know, I see how people respond to it and respond to me because of it. All different types of people in many different settings, but the reactions are such that I was just, and I mean, apart even from my personal experience, it's like the emotion that is generated from people, you know, when speaking about their hair and their experiences of their hair. So that combined, yeah, with people's responses to me and people's judgments about me based on my hair texture, I knew that it was like imbued with a deep significance, yeah, and power.
Yeah. Yeah. Another thread that you take up in the book that I think is really compelling and important is the way you talk about time in this book. And I'm
Mm-hmm.
paraphrasing, so if I'm mistaken in what I'm about to say, then please let me know. But I think you seem to be arguing for a move away from a kind of strict adherence to, I guess you call it a Western conception of time, which, as you put it, is kind of reflective of the notion that in the West, time is a commodity, towards a more kind of human-centered idea of time, which values human flourishing. Do I have that right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Cool. So how do we get to that kind of time as you know? And the reason why I think this is so interesting is because you kind of take on what we call in our community like CP time, colored people time. You know, the
Mm-hmm.
idea that you can, you know, sometimes, you know, we show up when we want to show up, when we're ready to show up, right? And in
Exactly.
certain
You know how it is.
in certain contexts, that's an issue. And I remember when I was growing up, my dad, you know, and it's funny because I grew up in a somewhat similar context. I grew up in Utah here in the US, which is, you know, basically 99.99% white. Um, and so my dad was always kind of endeavoring to ensure that we were comporting ourselves the right way to kind of succeed in this society. And one of the things that he made sure to say was that we had to be punctual, that if, you know, something was supposed to happen at 9, we should show up at 8:50. And
Mm-hmm.
looking back, I now recognize that part of what he was trying to do was to kind of say, he wanted us to signal to the folks that we were interacting with that we weren't that kind of Black person, whatever that may
Of
mean.
course. Mm-hmm.
So I'm wondering how we get to a place where we kind of restructure time, because the way that we think about time in the West is embedded in everything we do. How do we move away from time as commodity, away from time as an opportunity to kind of extract labor from me, towards time as a mode of, you know, sort of human flourishing, as a way of being in the world and respecting this idea that I need time to kind of think and live and take care of myself.
Well, I couldn't have predicted that the book would be being published in the midst of this pandemic
Sure. Yeah.
that has really allowed us to, well, I've read articles that say, and this isn't something I've gone into in depth, but I've just seen the idea kind of like floating around, that actually how we're responding to how we're experiencing time is shifting in this moment,
Yeah.
because of the nature of how our routine and that 9 to 5 daily grind has been interrupted, you know. So it's actually it's far more timely than I could have anticipated, because for me writing it, it was like an exercise in, so I think to achieve the world that you want and the reality that you want, you have to at first at least be able to imagine something, if not imagine it, because I understand how you might not be able to imagine it, but you have to be able to imagine something vastly different to what we currently have. And you have to know that things that we are taught and that we are conditioned to believe as just the way things are and is universally true and real are actually very culturally specific and constructed. There are many alternatives, and I find pre-colonial African cultures, and I'm sure this exists in lots of non-Western indigenous pre-colonial cultures, but my expertise is in West Africa. I find a lot of systems they had for organization incredibly inspiring in terms of thinking about more human-centered and even egalitarian ways of being. So as an act of imagination, you don't always have to create something that's entirely new, but you can actually also excavate kind of suppressed histories and pasts to look for some of those ideas, so I think that's what I was doing at the time. I didn't necessarily know how we would get there, but I thought it was important that people were familiar with the idea that time really can be organized very differently, and it can be understood as serving very different purposes. I'm also somebody who's chronically late, so I think possibly I was looking for justifications for my own poor time. I was like, it's culturally insensitive to expect me to be on top.
Amen. Preach, sister, preach. So I think there's another kind of element of time, or discussion of time, I guess I should say, in this book as well. You kind of talk about, and this is something that resonated with me because it also, I think in many ways it's reflective of my background, like the sort of constant negotiation and conversation in the African context between the past, the present, and the future. And how that kind of also changes the way that people see themselves in this reality, as opposed to the way that we think about time here in the West, which is the past. There's a strict line of demarcation, if you will, between the past and the present and the future. And you also kind of connect that to this kind of idea of Afrofuturism. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, and this kind of this idea about Afrofuturism and why that as a concept is important to you.
Yeah. So again, I think that Afrofuturism is a powerful antidote and space for an antidote to kind of rigid and reductive impositions, or not imaginings, rigid and reductive notions of Blackness. And it's a space where we can be more expansive and use our imaginations, but also tap into those ideas about time, and that idea that in Judeo-Christian time, which is seen as just progressing in chronological order with this linearity, and the impact that has on how people understand themselves and the world, putting that kind of in contrast with let me just take like I think the ethnic group that I refer to the most in the book is Yoruba, but this would be generalizable to like lots of other African groups as well. This idea that, as you've explained, the past, the present, and the future are in conversation with each other, and that is in many ways, manifest through the idea that in indigenous, or like in the kind of pre-colonial beliefs, which still exist, when you're looking at like kind of like Ifa and Orisha worship and stuff like that. This idea that the ancestral realm and us, the living and the unborn, are in communication with each other, you know, and it's like unfolding and cyclical rather than separately delineated. And just the way a society that believes in that, how that informs their principles in very different ways, you know?
Yeah. Just, okay, so we have a lot of questions coming in, so I'll ask a couple more before turning it over to the audience. Do you mind if we talk a little bit about identity? I mean, is that something you're comfortable with, or?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay,
That's
cool.
fine.
Yeah, so I asked that because, you know, it's one thing that has come up a lot whenever I'm talking about my book, and oftentimes I'm not sure I necessarily understand or comprehend why people sometimes ask questions, but I just wanted to make sure on the same page. Another kind of point of connection, I hadn't realized this, is that your dad went to Morehouse, right?
Yes, he did.
Yeah, so I went to Morehouse as well, and
Ah.
it's a really important part of my identity. And part of what you talk about in the book is spending some time. So you're born in Ireland, and then you go off to Atlanta for a bit. And I think in the first part of the book, there's a moment where you're kind of envisioning what your life would be like if you had stayed for a moment in Atlanta, like the kind of, you talk about, and Morrison talks about this in her work as well, this kind of sisterhood that exists between Black women and how important that is in terms of your sense of self and everything else, and how you missed that growing up in the context that you did. I'm wondering, first of all, how you see yourself, if there is a label that you kind of accept or adhere to. I was introduced, for example, as a Nigerian American writer, and that's what I say in my bio. I'm not sure that necessarily captures everything that I am, but it suffices, I suppose. I'm wondering if there's some label that works for you.
Yeah, so I think I was introduced as an Irish American.
Hey.
I think that's what Morgan said. I'm not an Irish American. I've never been described as an Irish American before, so that's the first. So I describe myself.
Take it on.
I don't feel it really encompasses who I am. So I usually describe myself as like Irish Nigerian, or Black and Irish, or a Black Irish. A Black Irish person. So yeah, any kind, or mixed Black. Yeah, but usually Black and Irish, I guess, would be the most common, or Irish Nigerian. Yeah, I don't know, any kind of variation of those.
Yeah, because I was struck in the book at certain points. At one point in the book, you say, I am an Irish woman. At another point, you say, I'm a Yoruba woman. And I think that's incredibly important to kind of embrace all of those ideas. I'm thinking, too, of the way that kind of Ireland operated in my mind when I was growing up, because as a writer, I read many of the great Irish writers, and they were very important to me. And even in terms of sort of like situating myself on a kind of continuum of writers across the ages, I suppose you could say. Like, I always found this association with Irish writing and Irish literature. I'm wondering if what Dublin means to you as a kind of center of world literature.
Yeah, that's such an interesting question. I think because when I was growing up, I felt like a lot of exclusion from Irishness, because I was always kind of told that I wasn't really Irish. So I was just like, okay, fine, I'm not. Sure. Okay, cool. I mean, that wasn't true, but that was kind of my response to it. I've always been like, I'm never going to beg anyone I'm never going to beg anyone to like let me be part of their thing, you know. I know, I can say at this age I know who I am, but at that stage, yeah, I guess I didn't as much, but my reaction was very much to be like, okay, fine, I'm not. Cool. Yeah. That's cool. Which I then had to deal with later on, because I feel like I suppressed a lot of stuff. But anyway, as a survival mechanism, that's where I was for a while. So I left as soon as I finished school. I left when I was still a teenager and moved to the UK. I read like so vociferously as a child, and I actually read a lot of Irish kind of mythology and folklore. I was really into that. If I hadn't come to SOAS and done African studies, I would have studied Irish folklore, probably at UCD. But I was really looking to, I think what I read the most of were Black American writers. And I really found like refuge in Black American literature. And I had to do Irish writers in school, but I loved Yeats's poetry. But with the exception of that, I think I was like, I associated it with something I was being forced to learn in school. I had very conflicting and complicated feelings towards my Irishness. So I was like focusing on another genre of writing, you know. But when two things happened. Like I started to actually reconcile myself with my Irishness and rehabilitate my relationship with Ireland over, I think in many ways, from being away. But I also came to realize how many of the not only Black American writers that I loved, but also the African writers that because my degree in my BA was in African studies, but I focused on literature. So how many, like Chinua Achebe, like Things Fall Apart,
Things
like
Fall Apart.
but like that's coming, you know, like from Yeats. Like how Toni Morrison or like Fred Moten, who's like one of my favorite philosophers, you know, he talks about like when he first discovered Joyce's writing, James Joyce's writing, and the influence that James Joyce has had on so many Black American writers and so many African post-colonial writers, the influence that Yeats had like on the Harlem Renaissance, and some of those writers, I was just like, oh my God, the connections. And as I started to, in myself, feel that I could be both Irish and Black and both Irish and Nigerian, one didn't have to exclude the other. I started to find those connections between the histories and between those writers and their themes, such a source of like inspiration.
Yeah. No, I think Joyce is somebody, we were just talking about time, for example, and time operates so differently in his work. He seems to be kind of offering a possibility of moving beyond this kind of, I guess, obsession with linear time and everything else in his work. And he's one of many Irish writers who have deeply impacted my work as well.
Yeah, but I think like I was kind of running away from anything that was Irish, but then the thing that I was running to was referencing back the thing that I'd run away from, you know? Yeah. So it was like this perfect circularity.
Yeah, that's wonderful. I think during this moment, we're spending a lot of time, I guess, thinking about people of color across the world, but particularly in the West, are talking more about the importance of having a seat at the table. And we're demanding inclusion, we're demanding to be part of this conversation. And towards the end of the book, you said something that I'm ashamed to say that I hadn't really thought about before. And it's especially ashamed because I spend most of my time thinking about these issues, whether it's with my creative work or my professional work, which is this idea, I guess I thought about it, but not the way that you said it in the book, which is this idea that if you want a seat at the table, like the table wasn't made for you, right? So why are you so desperate to get at this table? Or if you're, you want to be part of the conversation was started to exclude the likes of you. So yeah, let's start a new conversation. I think that's a really kind of radical and revolutionary way of thinking about our place in this world and how to kind of carve a space that is meant for us in a way, and in a space that perhaps can include others, but that was made with us in mind in some ways. I'm wondering how you came to that idea, and again, to the extent that you can, if you have any sort of suggestions about how we move in that direction.
Yeah, I'm not sure how I came to that idea, but I think it was, I don't think anyone's ever asked me that before. It's somewhere that I've got into over the years, I think, okay, so I remember like being about 11 or 12 and discovering that there had been a classical musician who was of African descent. And I can't remember his name, but it was really important to me. And I was like, oh my God, there's this guy who was like, kind of a counterpart to Mozart, but he's been written out of history and da da da. Now, as I got older, I started to think, I don't really actually care, because why is that expression of culture the pinnacle? There are African forms of music that are at least the equal of European classical music, but they're not given, and they're low culture and this is high culture. So at one point when I was pretty young, I had wanted to show, look, we're the same, we can be in these spaces. But I started to, from quite a young age, think that like, no, there are also, something doesn't have to, we don't have to have our parallel in a form that's exactly the same. There are other ways of being and knowing that are at the very least equal to European modes, if not something even, I don't want to talk about like really hierarchy, but at the very least they are equal, So I just started thinking about the way we're, conditioned to believe, again, coming back to what I was saying earlier, that like this particular expression of culture and civilization is superior to all others. But if you look at the chaos and the destruction and devastation that has been kind of unleashed on the world in the name of it, and the fact that environmentally we can't even continue to live our lives in this way, there have to be other ways of living and being that are more human centered. I'm also like a big fan of the Black radical tradition. And I think about, I talk in the book a little bit about W.E.B. Du Bois and his this movement that kind of broke away from, let me think, sorry, I'm just trying to think what I say. So yeah, so this idea that there was an emergent Black class that really just reproduced the same norms as the people who were oppressing them. And so the radical Black tradition kind of emerged as a split, as people that were saying, no, we're not just going to reproduce these same norms and institutions. We're actually going to create something that is liberatory and is just very other to this. So I think that's I think that's an idea that really inspires me.
Yeah. Cool. So I think I'll jump into the audience questions now. Let's see. So here's one from Isaac A. Do you think dreadlocks belong to Black people? Is it cultural appropriation for anyone other than Black people to wear dreadlocks? If so, where do you draw the line as far as who is Black and who isn't? The same question applies to braids.
Okay, so I always say, like with cultural appropriation, I have a chapter on cultural appropriation. I actually wish it wasn't something I had to talk about, because in a ideal world where there was a level playing field, anybody can wear whatever hairstyle they want to wear, like cultures, it might not suit your particular hair texture, but that's another story. Anyone should be able to wear whatever hairstyle they want. Cultures borrow and exchange and adapt, and there's like syncretism, and you know, this is how cultures like evolve. It's like kind of remixing and superimposing and all of this stuff like coming together like in this milieu, right?
Yeah.
But because of the power imbalance, to me cultural appropriation is about power. Because of the power imbalance, because of the fact that for at least 400 years the resources of Africa, the physical resources, the material resources, and the cultural resources have been extracted at the expense of the people who they come from, and to the benefit of others. When you think about the hairstyles, which might seem could be dismissed as maybe being quite superficial, but when you think about the appropriation of the hairstyles in that wider context of ongoing extraction to the impoverishment of Africa and to the accumulation of the great wealth of the West, when you put it in that context, that's why it's so emotive, you know? If you remove it from that context, you can be quite dismissive of it. And then I always think about the fact that there's a campaign that I'm working on here at the moment, and there's been the Crown Act in the States, where they've made it like illegal in a number of states to discriminate against Black people based on our hair. When we're living, and yeah, we're looking at trying to make that happen in the UK. When we're living in a world where Black people are discriminated against, are excluded from school, are punished, don't get jobs, lose jobs for the way our hair grows from our head, or from wearing the protective styles that are necessary to maintain our hair, and you have a white person or a white celebrity being celebrated for the same hairstyle, you see there's a very, very deep discrepancy, and it kind of it's quite revealing, you know? So it's far from a level playing field. That's the issue with cultural appropriation.
Yeah, I think that's really well said. Another question, did you ever manage to see Chris Rock's 2009 documentary, Good Hair?
I did, yes.
Do you think that has changed since that doc came out?
Yeah, big time. You know, I haven't seen the doc recently. I saw it when it came out.
Yeah.
And so I haven't seen it more recently than that. But yeah, I like the sales in Relaxer have slumped, have totally fallen off since then. So at that stage, when that movie was out, I still relaxed my hair. Most people I know still relax their hair. It was just you just relax your hair by default. You don't even really think about it, you know? Whereas now, the people I know who relax their hair are few and far between. You know, I still know some people who do, but it's not the default. It's just the assumption that that's what you're going to do, you know? So I think the world has changed hugely since then.
Yeah, cool. Here's another one from Donald Collins. He says, the not so hidden argument in the book is how do we as African diasporic people and humanity more generally break free from the West's most destructive ideas, from the use of the term worldview to how to live in balance with the world, using hair and hair cultures as a proxy? What specifically helped the author, you, find her way to this argument, as this is obviously about a lot more than hair? What caused her to see hair as a conduit for bringing folks more in touch with liberation and liberation ideology?
Thank you. I like that question a lot. So let me think, how do I approach that? Okay, so a lot of the stuff that I am interested in, hair is something that I'm interested in, like kind of independently, in that like a chapter of my PhD was looking at hair texture and the role that hair texture played in people of mixed ancestry, so usually one white and one Black parent, the role that hair texture played in how they were identified by others, and also how they identified themselves. Because all the studies previously had focused on skin color, and most of these studies were not done by Black people. So I feel that the potency of our hair was overlooked, you know? So I was just like, oh, I wonder well, I want to actually study I want to research the impact of the role that hair plays. So I had done this research on hair, because of my own relationship with mine. But then what I teach African studies at SOAS, and within that there's a lot of I look at, like, you know, different philosophies from different African countries, different spiritual practices, different histories. Okay, and some of that stuff is it's such it's so inspiring and it's so fascinating, but it's often not it's material information that's not widely known beyond a handful of scholars. So for me, hair was a way of, there's a lot of kind of mainstream interest in hair, you know. So hair, because it was of such significance as well to within African cultures and within Black cultures and in the diaspora, it was a way of introducing some of this other material that maybe doesn't have the same immediate kind of mainstream like identification with it. You know, if I wrote a book on African philosophy, it might not be as appealing to such a wide range of people. So this was going back to the idea the book is something of a Trojan horse.
Yeah.
So to me, hair was like a tool or a method for looking at some of that more esoteric stuff, but also bearing in mind that a lot of the cultures that I'm interested in were primarily oral cultures. Well, all cultures are primarily oral because our main mode of communication is oral in all cultures. And it's not to say that African cultures have no history of writing, the written word and written text. There are vast histories and libraries, but a lot of the cultures I was looking at were primarily oral. So because within orality there are lots of other languages beyond the spoken word, there's visual languages, I also thought, and so much was expressed, you know, visually through our hair. I also was like, hair makes a lot of sense as a way of as a source for accessing the past in an oral society where things might not be written.
Yeah, that's great. I see a question from the great Professor Parsons at Georgetown University, so I have to ask this question. Let's see, he says, I wonder if you could both talk about the meanings of the word and the identity Nigerian. Wait, somebody just asked a question. Let's see, let me start that again. I wonder if you both could talk about how the meanings of the word and the identity Nigerian might diverge between Ireland and the US, and how the specificity of Nigerian pushes back or doesn't in both places against a generic Africanness. So that's part one of the question. Part two is, and I'd love to hear from Emma about the choice to write nonfiction in Ireland, which is overrun with fiction writers. I'm especially interested in that question. So.
Okay, so the first question is
You
the difference. Yeah, yes, please.
Yeah.
Yes, please.
Okay, let's see. I wonder if you could both talk about how the meanings of the word and the identity Nigerian might diverge between Ireland and the US, and how the specificity of Nigerian pushes back or doesn't in both places against a generic Africanness.
Okay. So when I was growing up in Ireland, there was just a sense that anyone Black was just African, because people would always be like, oh, can you speak African? And when I moved back to the States, when I moved back to Ireland from the States, it was the year that Band Aid, what's that song? Do They Know It's Christmas Time?
Oh, gosh.
Yeah, was out.
Do they know it's Christmas?
And that was very heavy on the imagery of the Ethiopian famine. And because of the role of the Catholic Church in Ireland with missionaries, the image of being African was very much one of famine and impoverishment and primitivity and backwardsness. Yeah. These were very much the ideas that were kind of percolating, and I don't think people really specified Nigerian. They were just like, yeah, Black African, and therefore this. And then because there were so few Black people in the country, there was kind of the idea that like, which I think experienced from a lot of my teachers, was like this sense that you should be very grateful for being in Ireland, because you're obviously somebody that's, you know, from some famine-ridden country and somehow you've made it to Ireland. But like this assumption of kind of like gratitude, which wasn't forthcoming from me. And Nigerian specifically, yeah, no one would have really heard of Nigeria. I mean, I would say I was Nigerian. Around the time I left in the late 90s, there was starting to be there was a trickle of Nigerians moving there, which became much bigger around the time I left. But there was starting to be some Nigerian presence there. And there was like a big kickback against that. So people now started to associate Nigeria with illegal immigrants and refugees and people that were there to exploit the Irish state. So there were a lot of very inflammatory stories about Nigerians, you know, in the newspapers. And I'd say I was Nigerian and people were like, oh my God, like that's the most corrupt country on earth. So it actually started to become more specifically negative, specifically about Nigerians, rather than just kind of a generic African. I mean, I find the concept of Nigeria, it was like, you know, invented by Flora Lugard, like Lord Lugard's wife, kind of on a whim. She came up with the name. It doesn't really function as a state. I don't really see myself, actually, if I really go into it, like as Nigerian, I would see myself as like Yoruba more specifically. And even Yoruba is something of a colonial construction, because it was understood as far more local and specific than that. But yeah, I don't know. What about the States?
I could go on. I mean, short version is that I think much of what you said applies to the States as well, in that like there's a sense that people don't think about specific countries, that Africa is a country more or less, but that when people do start thinking about Nigeria, they think about, you know, the person who scammed some, you know, wonderful human being out in the middle of the country out of like $100,000, and Nigerians are crazy people. But I think that shifted a bit of late. You know, I think that Nigerians are seen more as, you know, like certainly the writing that's emerged from the continent, I think has shifted some people's perceptions. But even that's interesting because a lot of, you know, it's funny living here in DC, and I could go on at length, but I won't. But I think that one thing that does happen is that I think a lot of white folks who read have space in their heads for like one, like sort of writer who isn't from this context. And so for many people here in this country, Chimamanda's work seems to inhabit that space. And I think it's just a kind of living in a different, you know, they're like, yeah, she does that. But I think there's a growing awareness of the fact that there are a lot of people who are doing interesting work. And then I think athletics has changed that as well. You know, I grew up a rabid basketball fan. And so when I was young, a guy named Akeem Olajuwon played basketball. He was undoubtedly one of the best basketball players in the NBA. And for me, that was deeply important because I played basketball as well. So it was important for me to kind of associate myself with this guy who was, you know, this great basketball player. So I you know, I think that shifted a bit, but I think for the most part, if you cornered somebody who doesn't have, you know, much connection to Africa and you say Nigeria, you know, say what's on your mind, they'll say, oh yeah, the guy, the shoe bomber, right? Or the guy who, whatever.
Yeah, Nigeria doesn't have great PR, you know.
Yeah, no, we need to work on that. Absolutely. Let's work on, let's brainstorm. And I guess briefly, do you have a novel in you somewhere? Is this?
Yes. So fiction would be like my first love. You know, yeah. I don't even really read nonfiction that much. I read like academic books and I read fiction. Yeah. I don't really read like trade nonfiction. But I was too.
I'm sure there's a novel in a drawer somewhere, right?
Not yet. You know, I feel like I was too scared to attempt fiction, and I feel like the nonfiction was like my gateway drug. There's fiction coming. There's fiction coming.
The hard stuff. Yeah, the hard drugs are on the way. I know we're over time. I just want to ask one more question before throwing it out. You said something that I thought was really poignant in the book. You said at the beginning of the book, you talk about how you have, like, when you were young, you had a working relationship with the past and with your forebears. And I thought that was really beautiful because that's something that I felt too when I was younger, but I didn't have the language. And it also felt kind of illegal to say because, you know, I grew up in a very strict Christian household. So I wasn't about to start invoking like the voices or the impressions that I had that were very sort of important to me when I was younger. I'm wondering if you still feel that way, if you still have those conversations with the past and with your forebears.
Oh, wow. Um, I first of all, I feel like, so that means so much to me that you say that you felt the same way, because that's not, it's not every day I hear somebody say that. So that's yeah, that's really awesome to hear. And as a child, I couldn't have imagined that it's something that I would ever publicly express, and if I did, that people would respond well to. So it's been quite liberating to even, you know, be able to talk about it. But it was, as I say in the book, it was liberating to discover that what I was feeling actually made sense in terms of the Yoruba cosmology, you know, like it wasn't like that far out there. I would say that I still am somebody who feels, yeah, that the past is pretty foregrounded in my present. You know, I think about the past a lot, and a lot of things that I really like, a lot of things that resonate with me, be it things that I read, things that I watch, things that I listen to, objects are old, you know. Because something that I talk about in the book, like with Ariki, the Yoruba, the genre of poetry, well, there's lots of different types of Ariki, but with Ariki generally, part of their power is they bring with them the accumulated power of the past. So I often think things that are older, you know, resonate with me because I sense they have this power in them. I often don't read, like the book that I'm reading at the moment is written in the 1800s, and I don't actually tend to read things that have just come out. I'm certainly not the person that is hot on the newest releases. I will probably read them far into the future. I tend to read stuff that's a lot older. I listen to really old music. Well, I listen to quite a lot of trap as well. That's my guilty pleasure. But then I also listen to like much older music.
Hey, no, it's not guilty, trap.
People are just surprised. I don't know why. So yeah. So I like old stuff. It resonates with me often.
Sure. Well, I don't want to overstep any boundaries here, and I want to adhere to the current Western conception of time. So, Morgan, is now a moment we should pause.
Yes, I would like to thank both of you for this great conversation. And Emma, I would also like to apologize for saying you are Irish American. My notes are still up, and yes, I did say that.
No problem at all. I kind of enjoyed it for a second, but I had to correct it.
Yeah, all your bios say you're Irish Nigerian. I have no idea saying that. But before you all go, Emma, I know you said you're reading something from the 1800s, but would you like to state that title, and Tope, if you would like to let us know what you're reading as well?
Yeah, totally. I think it's just I'm always really, and this is another thing, I'm always really bad at remembering the title of what I'm reading, but it's a slave narrative, and it's amazing. I'm going to grab it now. 1 second.
We get a lovely view of the plants in Emma's space.
Hi, I hope I didn't flash when I stood up. My dress was shorter than I anticipated. Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl by Harriet Jacobs. It's really, really, it's just incredible.
So, I'm reading, let's see, a couple books. Let's be honest, I'm not doing a lot of reading at this moment, but when I do read, I read. So I've read this book called Travelers by Helen Habila. It's a really great book, really wonderful prose. It's about African immigrants in Germany. And I think for that reason alone, it's a really kind of important book in this moment in time. And the prose is, you come for the story, you stay for the prose, in my view. And I just had the pleasure a couple months ago of reviewing this book, which I wouldn't have read otherwise. It's called The Godchild. It's by a Ghanaian. Her name is Nana I am. Really enjoyed this one. And it's a book, we sort of spoke about this. It's a book that doesn't necessarily adhere to this kind of linearity, this idea that one thing follows another, or time functions in a very different way in this book. And so I highly recommend it for that reason.
Ah, I love Nana. We were at
Yeah.
SOAS together.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah.
Wow. That's cool. That's very cool.
Nice. Well, thank you all for answering that last question for me. And I would like to thank everybody who is watching. Thank you for tuning in on the behalf of Politics and Prose. Don't forget that you can purchase Twisted, The Tangled History of Black Hair Culture from our website. The link is still in the chat. And I hope everyone has a good evening.
Thank you. I really enjoyed it. Bye-bye.
Likewise. Bye.
Thanks, Tope.
Thank you.